This is Professor Grodman with another audio to be submitted to YouTube. This is class number 2 for summer 20. We're going to talk a bit about research in this audio. And research is a pretty critical aspect of psychology, of the field of psychology. And the function of research and the functions of research involve many things, including answering questions, observations, ideas. Sometimes these ideas are referred to as theories. Research employs also goes beyond the theoretical and will use statistical evidence or empirical, sometimes referred to as empirical evidence, to measure something, or even a physical measurement of a part of neuroanatomy or something that is more tangible in nature is part of this area of empiricism, of something that is measurable. And there are many things that are studied in psychology, many questions that are asked both theoretically, and many things that are investigated in a more quantitative sense, measurable sense. Let's talk about some of these. One of the big questions, and you can see this on your syllabus, has to do with the influences of nature and nurture. Nature is biological, nurture is environmental. And of course, we live in a world that is becoming more and more neurobiological, I guess, in terms of explanation. I guess this certainly is certainly speaks to the influences of psychology in other fields such as neuroscience and certainly medicine. But it's not that nature is the entirety or the explains the entire variance of an equation. There is a complex compilation of factors involved in understanding behavior. So, for example, intelligence is influenced by nature, probably 50% or more. When intelligence is studied, and actually when intelligence is studied, it's what might be referred to as more cognitive or school-related intelligence. But also nurture factors come into play. Certainly your family of origin, your school, other influences that are environmental. Actually, one of the best predictors of your IQ, supposedly a measure of some aspect of intelligence, is the school you go to. So that certainly is an example of nurture. Other traits are studied, and many things are studied in abundance, and we'll talk a little bit about this toward the end of today's discussion. But there is a real diversity of areas of research and investigation. But let's look at another trait. I guess in some sense, intelligence is a trait. So, but there are more what might be referred to as more traditional personality traits, such as, are you an outgoing person? Are you extroverted? Are you more withdrawn, introverted? And these are sort of two opposite ends of a continuum. The reality is that we're introverted some of the time, we're extroverted some of the time for most of us. That situational factors, which are really connect to nurture, come into play. However, your temperament and your environment both shape your behavior. So, for example, if you're an introverted person, that's partially dispositional, biological, but it is also influenced by the what you were impacted by environmentally. So nature, nurture come into play with traits such as not only intelligence but also introversion and extroversion. Another example of temperament would be aggression. Actually, this is one in which definitely nature comes into play. And they've looked a lot at gender differences with regard to aggression, and that males are more likely to be aggressive. And how much of that is socialized or more nurture influenced, and how much is more biologically based. And they find actually it's both. That there really is a distinct gender difference with regard to aggression that is not in any way purely environmentally explained. It is again that sort of that complex mix of nature nurture. So aggression is yes, it has definitely has a nurture component. If you are raised in an aggressive environment, you're more likely to be aggressive. They've looked at this with people with something called antisocial personality disorder. disorder in which, not that you're not social, that's sort of the lay definition or lay description, but rather you violate the rules of society, the mores, sort of the norms or conventions of society. And why is it you do that? Well, some of it is learning through the models you see and the sort of reinforcers or rewards that you might get if you act in that manner. But they also find that there are neurobiological and biochemical differences in people who are really prone to violating the rules with regularity and with without regard for authority, and often do so without anxiety or conscience. It really involves a lot of different characteristics to sort of be considered antisocial in a psychiatric diagnostic sense. But if you were to meet those criteria, about 1 to 2% of the population does. It can't simply be explained by socialization or nurture. There is a nature component. Other psychiatric disorders, and technically antisocial personality is a psychiatric disorder, actually a pretty severe one. But other psychiatric disorders are also explained by biological and environmental factors, nature, nurture. For example, bipolar disorder, where you have extremes in highs, mania, which can actually be destructive. You can be so your energy level and your thinking so influenced by this biochemical increase in neurotransmitters such as serotonin that it actually affects your ability to function adequately. You can even become delusional, where you start to believe things that have no foundation, or hallucinatory, see and hear things and taste and touch and smell things that other people don't. That is a really that's an extreme psychiatric manifestation, more typically associated with schizophrenia, but can also be connected to bipolar disorder. Bipolar is most associated with the mania, the energy that people may not sleep for days on end and sometimes become hyper creative. But ultimately, it's really not something that normally works in your favor. That's the mania associated with bipolarity, and the other pole being depression. And that sort of mix, that continuum, that real extremes of range are not just explained by having a stressful life. You really have to have a biological predisposition to that, along with probably certain stressors in your life. Schizophrenia that does not have mania but has those hallucinations or delusions, sometimes referred to as psychosis, is also something you'd have to have a predisposition to, along with probably some degree of stress. So again, nature, nurture. In the case of both bipolar and schizophrenia, although they are different disorders. Just to throw one more in the mix, and no pun intended, with alcoholism. Alcoholism has certainly a nurture piece. If you're exposed to alcohol, if you see models, people around you who are drinking, you're more prone to drink, especially when you're young. But there is also some evidence that some people are more predisposed than others to alcoholism. So again, this nature-nurture combination. How was this found out? Through research. So for example, just to back up, so how do they know this? Well, what does the research indicate specifically? Well, the research indicates that if you're an identical twin, for example, and you're raised in an environment that is highly stressful, you're more prone to schizophrenia or bipolar or other forms of depression and many other things psychiatrically than your identical twin who is, assuming you were not raised together, who is in a less, you're more prone to than the other twin is living in a more insular, more protected environment. So, but you both would have to have a predisposition, and the fact that you have that genetic linkage, you would both have that. But it doesn't necessarily display itself equally with both children or both adults, in fact, depending on your age. So that the nurture piece comes into play even if you have that predisposition with anyone, including identical twins. There is also a bidirectional effect of nature nurture. And what do I mean by that? Well, one of the things they've learned, and again, this is all found. These are the result. What I am talking about, what I'm speaking of, is really a function or a product of research. and the study of many different things. And but these are sort of general conclusions. And a general conclusion with regard to what I refer to as the bidirectional effect of nature and nurture is that nature affects nurture, and nurture also affects nature. Okay, what is that about? Here's some examples. If you're born, maybe you're born sort of colicky, and then as a very young child, you see signs of aggression. That human being is probably prone to a more stressful world. How is that possible? Well, by being aggressive, your world probably will not receive you as well. Not in every case, but we speak in terms of when they talk about research, the sort of the average of the data, the average of the averaging of a large number of people or subjects. This is the aggregate, in the totality or the aggregate of the data. And the data would indicate that if you're sort of born with a temperament which is aggressive or in some ways you're sort of just naturally sort of up and down, labile, that's a little different than aggression. But both are examples that it's likely your world won't receive you as well and that there'll be more stress in terms of nurture, that you may be rejected by peers or by adults, including maybe even your parents. And so that nature has an effect on nurture. That is consistent again with the research or the literature. There is also some fascinating evidence that your nurture affects your nature. So if you live, and this is sort of alluded to before, if you live in a protected, more insulated environment, it's less likely to activate a mental illness or behavioral disorder. So I don't know, let's say you're prone to depression biologically. If your environment is more protected, it's less likely to activate that depression, or at least for some period of time. It may be that later on in the lifespan it gets activated, but at least for that period in which you are protected, you're probably less likely for it to get activated. It actually might even have some long-term effects too. You may be more likely or less likely to be symptomatic with depression even as a middle-aged adult. But more likely even in the early years, it's more predictive of that in the early years. If your environment again is protective, that affects the activation of something like depression. It also affects again your biology in terms of anatomy and chemistry. People who have stressful environments have been shown to have more issues with peers, and that rejection from peers may affect your health in some respect, may affect your blood pressure, your any of the measures that are cardiovascular in nature. They've actually found that if you're stressed, your stress hormone cortisol increases, and if you're living in a stressful environment, and that actually affects your biology, just cardiovascular health. Just looking at it that way, not even in terms of your brain, but just in terms of some of the things that are more specific to your cardiovascular functioning, and your brain is also affected in turn. So these are examples of nature affecting nurture and nurture affecting nature, and they all come from research. This is all tied in with research investigations. And the breadth of psychology research is rather impressive. The number of areas that have been studied, is, I wouldn't say limitless, but it really is. There really is an impressive amount of diversity and scope to the number of areas of research. Probably the depth is less than the breadth. So, and that may have something to do with the nature of graduate school research and all the different master's level theses and doctoral dissertations, and just the sort of the range and diversity of investigations that come from having a population of folks who do different sorts of work, and the number of choices are just so great in number. So this is the end of audio 2. dealing with research methods, or just about the end. Let me just hit a few points. The function of research is is many. We talked about theories are developed through observation, through experience, and research employs physical and/or statistical evidence to determine if these theories have validity or not. And there are many areas which are studied, but many research investigations have looked at the relative influences of nature nurture. That's certainly a big area of research in psychology. So we talked about some things such as intelligence, bipolar disorder. These are independent entities, schizophrenia, alcoholism. And the general finding is that nature nurture both contribute to these disorders, that you have a biological, for many of them, separate from intelligence. With bipolar, schizophrenia, alcoholism, substance abuse, and psychiatric disorders, there's probably a biological predisposition in most cases, and your environment either kicks it, it triggers it, or not. And then we talked about the bidirectional effect of nature nurture that has been found based on the literature and these research investigations, that nature affects nurture and nurture also affects nature, and the breadth of the scope of this research is pretty immense. So this is now officially the end of Audio 2, class number 2. I will be presenting class number 3 in the days, probably the next few days. So please be be mindful of that, and be aware of the need to check Blackboard to see the latest updates and be able to follow the class. In each section of Psych 111 this summer, before each exam, we'll have a WebEx, the class before each of your respective 4 exams. So also keep that in mind. Take care. Bye-bye.